There is a certain depth to language and symbols that are only going to be understood by what I'm calling initiates. Therefore, what the masses might perceive as certain aspects of language, certain words, certain symbols, might be the definition that is given to the masses, but it means something completely different when you're on the level of initiates. And in this way, the codes or the truths can actually be communicated, but only among elites, only among those with eyes to see, so to speak. So if you were to consider how on the astral level when things manifest and when things are going on in the non-physical spaces that are essentially like the loading zone before they get to earth, before things become physical, become 3D, become manifest, what happens is what ends up manifesting on earth is a reflection, an example of what might be manifesting on that higher plane, and it comes through looking exactly like that. To put this into simple terms, it's like the way that an apple tree makes apples. Within that apple tree, there is the DNA, there is the information that creates specifically an apple. So, therefore, when you see certain symbols, certain words on this plane, those words connect to things that exist in the astral planes and exist higher than that. But most people are blind to that. So, therefore, we have all these symbols, and people might have no idea what these symbols are and how that actually points to what things are composed of. A very basic example of this is the star or the pentagram, right? This represents a being. And whenever you see stars, whenever you see it, particularly like, let's talk about the United States flag, right? So we have the 50 stars on that. First off, that number 50 is a representation of Marduk, okay? But next you have the 50 stars, and each one of those represents a specific being. So, in other words, this United States, this flag that's representing this specific thing, is these 50 beings. And Marduk, because of the number 50, perhaps he's one of the 50 beings, but that specific number belongs to him. In other words, when you see that number show up specifically on something like a flag that governs a country, that means something, right? It's the same way that if you look at the Chinese flag, you have a single star on there. So that's probably like one being that is equal to, somewhat equal to the 50 beings that exist on the American flag, right? When you have countries that are of a similar level of power, if you will, and you see this one is 50 and this one is one. So if you think about that, that might be a bunch of small beings, and then you have like one dragon, something along the lines of that, right? So, one thing I want to point out today is some of the modern things that might be going on within our world and how I'm perceiving them. And I want to give a little disclaimer. This is not to hate upon any groups or movements or anything like that. I'm simply talking from the level of symbology and language and how these things connect and what that might be pointing to. All right. So, with that, let's talk about Mr. T, if you will. Right. So if you look at the names of the presidents, okay, especially these people in power, like I said, it's all a code, and they have to be using that code in order to disclose information. I have to go on a bit of a tangent here because this is important for you all to understand. Um, there's a sort of karmic law in place that when the elites, the puppet masters, if you will, are actually doing something in the reality, they have to disclose what they're doing, and the people have to agree to it willingly, because otherwise it creates karma for them. So the way that they do this is through, like I said, there's an initiate level of the language and there's a masses level of the language. What they're doing is they're still communicating it, but most people don't understand it at the level of the initiates. So all of these words, all of these symbols, all of these numbers, the languages, all of this, the flags, they all point to something that exists on an astral level, and people don't see it as that. Okay, so with this, we have we have Trump, right? President Trump. And what a trump card is. What is a trump card in a deck of cards? It's the Joker, right? And now this is what's interesting about this, because a Joker is not, this is where we need to step out of the dualities. We need to step out of he's the worst or he's the best, whatever side of that you're on. I'm not here to invite you to polarize. I'm here to invite you to see what is the Trump. What is the Joker? So that means they're playing the trump card right now. They're playing the Joker. And a Joker, like I said, it's not a good or a bad thing. Okay, if you have a deck of cards and you add the Joker to it, the Joker can take the face of any of the cards that you might need to have a better hand, to have a better play, or it can be useless. It kind of depends. It's one of those, like, it can take on one of the other archetypes in order to produce a specific result. Now, as far as what that result is, that might be yet to be seen, because there are a lot of elements at play here as to what's going on. If we look back in time, we had Biden, which is bid, and then we had Putin, which is put. And now what are bid and put? What are those two things correlated with, right? So we had the Ukraine thing going on, and then the US getting involved with the Ukraine thing, and then you had bid and put. Those are market terms, right? If you want to, especially like with options, you put a bid or a put, right? And you're either buying it or you're selling it. And this was a time when, because of the specific war situations, there was a huge wealth transfer that happened under the table. You know, you could see it if you're involved with markets and you're involved with like how that all that current is actually flowing. But like I said, for the majority of people, they didn't see these names. They didn't see what was going on with bid and put and what's going on with that. So that's, now that that is finished, we have Trump that's going on right now. And then we have essentially these agendas and these things that are going on in the East, like we're seeing with Israel, ISIS, Ra, El, and Iran, right? Which is another Ra word. So this is that same god Ra, and Ra again is Marduk, like I said, which is the 50 on the United States flag. So one of the things, and I want to talk about this from a very theoretical perspective because it's taken me a while to actually develop this viewpoint. It's been a theory for me for a while, but knowing as I do, and as I'm sure many of you do, that Israel is in fact in control of the White House. If we're talking about national debt and we're talking about who do we actually owe that debt to, it is essentially what is called Zion, right? This is why even in the movie The Matrix, we had this Zionism thing where they're like, Zion is the sanctuary. But in real life, Zion, they're like the ones who own everything. And that comes from Israel, right? So Israel is actually like in the US, and the presidents, regardless if it's a red or a blue team, there's somebody in there that bows to them. They're bowing to that specific god, which is El, which is Saturnus, which is the cube, right? It is that black cube that they're all bowing to, which is a representation of Saturnus or Saturn, or like I said, El. Now, this gets more interesting when we start to see the movements such as what we have now in the United States. I'm not sure if this is a worldwide thing. It probably is, but we have the whole Pride Month going on in the United States. And again, my disclaimer is I'm not trying to hate on anybody here. I'm talking about the symbolism. Essentially with what these symbols are, because whenever you have letters are characters. These characters are connected to certain stars, and when you put them together, especially when whatever the acronym keeps getting longer and longer and longer, it means more entities are getting on board, which tends to mean it becomes more confused. It becomes more distorted. It becomes further away from what is actually like the circle, right? Like the simple, the whole self, the supreme self. We're getting further away from that the more that we label it. The more that we call it this, okay, now we're going to add this, now we're going to add this. The more we add, the more we divide. So if you were to think about the polarities of a supreme being, of a whole being, the one that is whole has unified all of its aspects. The one that is the furthest away from that truth is going to be completely divided. It's going to have all of it because it can't get along with itself, right? It's going to have all of its aspects scattered around and doing different things because they don't want to be together. So that's what happens when you get these letters, the characters, and they start splitting up, and now they're represented by a character. And when you raise a flag for something, you're declaring us and them. You're declaring essentially like an ethnocentric reality where it's us and then them, and you're going to war with something. So that's what these flags are. Again, they're declaring these beings and these beings, but they don't necessarily get along, right? So within L, G, B, and T, okay, you have El, which is, like I said, the god El, which is Saturnus, which is what Israel is worshiping. That's their cube. Okay, then you have G, which is the 6, And this is also like the Freemason G. And the Freemasons, I'm not going to claim to completely understand their traditions and practices, but I know that when they do things, they leave their calling card, so to speak. So there's a G. The G is a 6, and like I said, the 6 is also the 6-pointed star. Which, where do you see that on? The flag of Israel. And what did I say when there was a star on something? It's talking about a specific being. So you have L, you have the star of 6, and then you have BT, which this has been my theoretical part of this, relates to Baphomet, or the baptism. So I know that BT, that's kind of a stretch for getting to something like this, but here's why I believe this to be true. So the Catholic churches, when they were to perform baptisms or baptisms, would call on their God, which at that time would have been Elohim. Okay, so El is the masculine component of this, and Ohim is the feminine component of this. So you would get El and Ohim coming together. You get Elohim, and they would call on this, and essentially then they would perform the baptism. The baptism, okay? And this was a process of calling in a spirit to actually like become involved with an individual. And the interesting thing here was, if you were to get a spirit that would have been like, their sexual orientation would have been adjacent to the individual. This is essentially where you get like the old men priests that would all of a sudden be into like boys and stuff like that. That's where this would come from, because they'd have a spirit come in that would be of some different polarity sexually. And if you think of Baphomet and what that entity actually represents, Baphomet was a hermaphrodite, right? Baphomet was this aspect of like, it's not either of the polarities. It's a neutral in that aspect. And you get the horns, right? I'm not going to call this being evil. I'm not going to call it good. I'm just going to call it this neutral entity. But the point that I want to make with this is, I think the combination of these beings is actually what the whole pride movement has to do with. I don't think this has anything to do with people themselves and their orientations. I think the movement itself has to do with these entities, because we tend to see these themes on Earth. Think of like in the early 2000s when we were having kids and they were doing the cutting thing. Like that was another aspect of this, just another way that something is getting into the psyche to actually harm the individual. Now, at this point in time, this is, I think, an agenda by Israel within the United States to actually make the United States conquerable. Because if they get people out of their polarities and they essentially remove the positive and the negative, they remove the polarities, you no longer have your power, right? You no longer have your balance. You no longer have what you actually need to ascend and to actually charge and to actually be powerful and create your own energy. So this is what I think the combination of these entities are actually creating, this aspect within the United States where people are like, this is a movement for freedom and equality and justice, when in reality, this is something that came from Israel, which is running the United States, and now they're trying to weaken the population and the whole unit of like embracing our polarities and trying to turn us into very like neutralized. Quite literally, they want to neutralize us by doing this. And this is how they're disguising it as like, this is a freedom movement, right? This is something about this and that. But like I said, I'm not trying to hate on any groups or anything. Do what you want. But look, this is the symbolism. The L is always the god L, Saturnus. It's the cube. The cube is Saturn, which is the slowest moving planet. It is lead. It is heavy. It is dense. And this is their god. This is the one that they worship. I've talked about gods before and how gods really need people to like plug into them, or the god becomes weak. And when you have people throwing up these symbols, and like I said, when you have the symbols, those exist as specific stars on the astral plane. So like I said, people will look at this and be like, oh, that means this word and this word and this word and this word, and it represents us, right? And not them. But they don't actually see what these letters mean because they don't know where the letters came from. You have Elohim, you have the 6, and you have Baphomet, you have baptism, right? So with that, my friends, it's important to pay attention to what's going on, and it's important to really move with integrity through this point of time where the world is becoming uncertain, and recognize that within yourself, you already have everything that you already need, okay? It's important to understand these things too. Like I said, you don't have to be like some initiate of some secret society in order to actually read the code. and learn about it. Study some occultism. Don't be afraid of it. Like, learn what the letters mean, learn what the symbols mean, and learn how they're putting all this out in front of you so they can do it and get away with it. Because they're literally on the level of like karma and consciousness, they're literally saying, we're telling them what we're doing, and they're agreeing to it. In fact, they are fighting for it. They want it so bad. Like they're choosing it. Think about that, okay? It's not about they're forcing something onto us and they're doing this. They're telling you exactly what they're doing. But the problem is people are choosing it. People don't understand it. So they're getting involved with it and saying, this is me, like this is what I am. And they're identifying with all these forces that they might not understand. Okay? I'm not saying to like you need to shape yourself into some specific individual or anything like that. Be who you are, but recognize what these groups are, recognize what these entities are, and recognize what they're trying to do to your consciousness. Because, my friends, so long as they keep us in a state of division, which, like I said, is that ethnocentric principle of essentially saying us and them, there's us and them. It's these beings, and we're separate from them. Like I said, the further down you go, the more divided you go because they don't like to be with each other. You depolarize. It's like when you were, if you took a magnet and you broke a chunk off of it, it would be really difficult to get those pieces back together. They wouldn't want to go back together. And that's what happens when you enter into a divisive state of consciousness, which people do willingly because they don't understand the codes. They're sending you down these rabbit holes of not understanding the codes. So you break off those parts of yourself and you become fragmented and you become neutralized. When you need to understand your positive and negative polarities, you need to understand the power in your design, the power that we already have innately in order to actually ascend above this and actually see the unseen, which is the occult. Okay? It is for those to see, and it is for those with the minds that are actually open to perceive these things. Because a lot of people hearing this message would trigger them because they have their whole identity is based on a certain ego perception of I am this group. I identify with this group. It's the blue ones for me. It's the red ones for me. I'm the rainbow one. No, I'm the one with the six-pointed star. They're saying I'm this and I'm this. None of those are you. They're symbols, and these symbols are used to trap your consciousness within them because at the fundamental basis of what these symbols are, it is a container. You don't need to be putting yourself in a container. You need to learn to see yourself as the supreme being and not choose to polarize yourself, break yourself apart into these containers in order to have your power. All right, my friends. So we went deep on that one. I hope that makes sense. Hope that helps. And with that, be whole, be well, and we'll talk soon. Take care.